In the early 2000s, I began to have a strange feeling that something was wrong in my life, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was more of a nagging sensation in the beginning. Like something is just behind your shoulder and you need to turn around and get it. But when you turn around, there's nothing there. I had so much going on in my life at that time that I just chalked it up to stress and figured it would just go away. I was wrong, though, because it didn't go away. It grew. I began to notice that something seemed a bit off. Like time, for example. It seemed to pass quicker than it used to pass. For all practical purposes, these were the same days, with the same hours in them, in my same old life, and yet they seemed to be going by considerably faster to me. And I wondered if it could be that I was just overwhelmed, overworked. But I've been overwhelmed before and overworked for most of my life. Most of us have. So why all of a sudden were things seeming to be different? But the strangest part was that it suddenly began to feel like nothing was happening in my life anymore, or in the world for that matter. Oh, there would be small scuffle here and there, but it was always a redoing of the same old scuffle, and nothing seemed to be moving forward. There were no new medical or spiritual or psychological interventions. Everything was at a standstill. Medicines were recycled, new names, same old addictions. Religions came and went, same old manipulation. So-called psychological breakthroughs were the same old rehashed games that people play. It was kind of like that movie Groundhog. Ever see that? Where Bill Murray wakes up in a time loop and every day is exactly the same day, over and over and over. Was that a foreshadowing? Were they letting us know there that a shift was going to take place soon, and we were all going to be little hamsters running on a wheel but going nowhere? Because I started to feel like that. I started to feel that each day was the same day, every single day. Then came the day when, as an avid reader, and I always had my nose in a book, I bought yet another book. I started reading it. But by the time I got to the third chapter, I actually picked it up, threw it across the room, at the wall, and I screamed, "Bullshit!" Because it suddenly occurred to me that every book I was reading was the same book. That's right. Every single book seemed to be saying the same thing, just mixing the words around but using the same old literary formulas. Just like days, every day, every book seemed to be the same, you know? Oh, sure, they use different words, but every book seemed to have the same theme, with the same morals, the same rewards and punishments, the same ideas, the same so-called breakthroughs, the same hand behind the same writing. And I didn't even want to read anymore. Well, let me tell you, for someone who's a writer and a reader, that's a huge tragedy. That is a tragedy. And so I became depressed and despondent, yet still the same day dragged on and on and on. And I was just going through the motions, but I didn't feel like I was living. Quite the opposite. I felt dead. But that's not something you run around telling everyone. "Hello there, guess what? I think we're all dead." Yeah, right. That's something you simply do not do. People will think you're crazy. So I pretty much kept it to myself and just kept noticing. I kept looking for clues. In addition to time passing by a bit faster and faster each day, I began to notice that the sun looked different. It seemed to be blaring and literally blinding, like horrible. I've always been sensitive to the sun and burn easily, but this was like a ball of hell in the sky. And it was bright white, and yet I remembered it as being light yellow. Yeah, it used to hurt your eyes a bit to look straight into it in the 60s and 70s, but you could do it. Now, forget about it. Forget about it. And you might say, oh, well, you're just getting old. Time passes quicker for you because of that. Your eyes are more sensitive. No. So, first I saw a shift in time, then I saw a change in the sun, and then a shift in the seasons. No, I am not talking about global warming here. I'm also not talking about the year-to-year subtle differences in weather that have always occurred. I'm talking about all the seasons seeming to start about a month later than they used to. And at first I thought it was just a quirk. But it went on year after year, and it hasn't stopped. The seasons have definitely shifted. And again, this is not about a climate crisis. This is about a shift. I'm talking about a shift. And then one day, out of the blue it seemed, it hit me. I suddenly wondered out loud and clear if I was dead. What if I'm already dead? That's what I asked myself point blank. I mean, it sounded kind of crazy, but it sure would explain a lot of things, wouldn't it? What if I was dead? What if I had died a long time ago? What if we all had? Then the time getting away from me and seeming to go by quicker would make a lot more sense, especially if I was not conscious of being dead. And yes, I do believe that our consciousness goes on after we die. So the longer I was away from the real timeline, the one where things actually used to happen, the longer I was away from that, the more time began to drift and shift. That started to make sense to me because nothing else was making much sense, that's for sure. And so I walked around with the beginning of this theory in my mind that I and everyone else in the world was already dead. But I found out I wasn't the only one. I thought I was in the beginning, but it turns out a lot of other people were wondering the same thing. And you know what they say, there's strength in numbers. How did we all come to that conclusion? I mean, it's not every day you wake up and say, hey, I wonder if I'm dead. Yet I began to hear whispers of it from other people who had noticed as well. Of course, most people can't even begin to entertain the idea, though, and because they can't handle it, their minds invent this so-called life we're all in, so they can cling to their fragile idea of reality and, therefore, sanity. I totally get that. But there are glitches. A big one for me was the Mandela effect. I'm sure you've heard of that, and if you look it up now, the internet is just full of cover stories. One cover story after another, and they're all so obvious about being cover stories and making sure that they implant the idea that those who believe in the Mandela effect are a bit weird, eccentric, mental, and downright odd. They call it a false memory. It's misremembering, they say. It's disambiguation. That's a big word, disambiguation. Well, a lot of people don't want to associate with someone who is disambiguated. And so, these cover sites work really well. Oh no, you're a conspiracy theorist. Nah, I'm just someone who notices. I'm just someone who looks around and sees things that most people don't see. Maybe you're one of those people who sees things too. But anyway, there are also controlled opposition groups pretending to believe in the Mandela effect, and they have infiltrated the whole idea with a tremendous amount of garbage, so that no one in their right mind would admit to having anything to do with it. But let me tell you what actually happened. And I know because I was there. South African President Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s. He wasn't the president then, just a troublemaker, like all of us have the potential of being. I read the magazine article about it myself. I remember it quite clearly. He was not well thought of, if I recall. He clearly died, and yet the world now wants to tell us that Nelson Mandela died in 2013. That is a bold-faced lie. When I first heard it, I wondered if it was someone with the same name, or if someone was playing a joke. Surely it couldn't be the Nelson Mandela because that man was dead. But they try to tell us we're wrong. You're misremembering. It's mass hypnosis. No, it isn't, and don't you believe it either. So, are we all already dead? Well, I can tell you about 2 times when I actually did medically die in a health crisis. The first, that I recall anyway, was shortly after giving birth. My heart stopped for a very short time. During that time, I remember clearly I was so sad. I was sinking into the ground again, and everything was black and white. There were no colors. And I was sad because it was happening before I had a chance to tell someone something that I was supposed to tell him. I wished so badly I had told him. I was so filled with regret. Then they revived me, and I wasn't dead anymore, or so I'm told. Thankfully, I actually did get a chance to tell him shortly after that, but it didn't make enough difference. So, the next time I die, anyway, that will be the one thing I won't have to regret not doing. Then there was the time in 2013 when I fell off a cliff. My daughter and I were bike riding, and a car came whipping around a corner under a small bridge, and we were just before the bridge. It was a single-lane road. My daughter was on the land side, but I was on the side that had a sheer drop to some rocks a good way below, and the ocean was beyond that. When the truck came, there was no room at all, and in a split second I envisioned it hitting me, and I knew I would lose my legs if it did. Well, I couldn't bear the idea of having no legs, so I made an instant decision and took a chance and went over the cliff. I tried to make the bike front tire take the biggest hit on the rocks below, which it did, but then it flipped me over the handlebars onto my head, and I was gone. Except I wasn't gone. I came to a while later. I was told that I had had some seizures. My daughter had screamed for help, and a nurse just happened to be in that very remote area, and she helped us. An ambulance came and took me to the hospital. I had fractured my orbital floor, which means I kind of broke my face, but the bones didn't move. I had a concussion, and the left side of my body was full of contusions. A spiky rock had entered the left side of my head, and the hospital staff were worried that it had damaged my brain. But I had an MRI done, and my brain was fine. I will never forget the look on the hospital nurse's face as I was getting ready to go at the end of the day. She looked me in the eyes very closely and said, "You got really lucky." And I'll never forget that, how she looked, how big her eyes were. So I went home and I was alive again, or so I'm told. In Michael Crichton's book, Timeline, which was almost ruined by the movie Timeline, which was simply a dreadful film, but in the book was awesome. People traveled back in time, but they do it by actually traveling in another universe, one of zillions of universes in the multiverse we live in, that is very close to our own universe, like a hair's width away. The closer the universe is, the closer are the identical people and situations, although they're never completely identical. There are small, teeny tiny changes and glitches. But anyways, in the book Timeline, that's how people travel back in time. They actually die in this universe, in this world that we're in right now, and then they're reconstructed in one that is almost identical. So for all practical purposes, it's the same world, and yet it's not exactly. Now, there are theories about this in physics, and you can look it up. Just look up the multiverse. Some say that universes can collide with other universes, each having a gravitational pull on the other, causing physical changes in the other universe. Yeah, I know, it gets a little involved, but hear me out. If that's true, I can't help but wonder if during those 2 times I told you about when I died in the health crises, maybe in one of the universes I actually did die, and maybe in another of the universes I didn't. So like in the world I died in when I was giving childbirth, my baby would have had to grow up without a mother. In the world where I stayed alive, life went on and I raised her. And the same thing goes for the world where I died in the biking accident. My daughter would have had to continue living with her mother having died on an afternoon outing. In the world where I stayed alive, life went on and we had many more adventures and still do. Does it sound weird? I'll bet many of you listening to me either had your own harrowing experience or you know someone who did have a near-miss death but somehow ended up okay and yet forever changed. After the accident, the person is just never the same. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean. But many people believe that we're all living in a computer simulation, that a huge computer just runs various endless scenarios of life after life after life. When we die in one life, we wake up in another and we keep going. Some say it's because we all died a long time ago and our consciousness was uploaded to a program that just runs and runs. Others say it's a training ground before we move on to another dimension. But does anybody remember the lockdowns for the illness which must not be named? People began to notice glitches in the Matrix back then. Maybe you were one of them. Remember? The simulation started to malfunction a bit. People started to notice that all of reality was based simply and solely on words and nothing else, on beliefs and not facts. And here we are, stuck again in something that never seems to move or change. Groundhog Day every day. Some people follow a religion that believes in reincarnation, that we die and are reborn again and again until we get it right, until we become better beings and we perfect our souls. Others follow a religion that says we have only one life, but then we die and go on to a life in an eternal life in heaven. But either case, either way, there always seems to be people dying and then living again. So I wonder, what if our souls are connected to the earth that we live on because the earth itself is also a living being? What if that's why we're told that we were formed out of the soil of the earth? What if we're supposed to perfect our souls through several cycles, and then after having learned our lessons, our souls go out into the universe as a new being? But what if some dark figures from another dimension were at play here, and were stopping our souls from branching out into the universe, from reaching our full potential? Some people say that we are trapped in our timeline by these dark figures who are currently running the world right now. So we die, but instead of ascending into heaven or wherever we ascend to, we plunge back down again and again and again and just keep recycling so these dark characters can just keep harvesting us. And it's up to us, and perhaps there are ascended beings who are helping us as well, to wake up and open our eyes and see the multidimensional reality around us and see that the soul cannot die, but it can be trapped. Because I think that's where we are right now, trapped. Now, that might be too out there for some folks, but whatever, because I know that something is definitely happening to us and to the planet. I don't completely understand what it is, but I know something odd is happening, and I think a lot of other people see it too. And I also think that someday those dark figures will be ousted and we will see the light. So I continue on. I notice things, I chronicle them. I try to grow and be kind, because I know we're all in this together. Do you ever remember a time when you weren't here? I don't either. Rumi said, "This place is a dream. Only a sleeper considers it real. Then death comes like dawn, and you wake up laughing at what you thought was your grief."